In 1966, a soft-spoken aerospace engineer named Dr. Chan Thomas walked into a publisher's office carrying a manuscript he believed could rewrite everything we think we know about human history. Within months, that manuscript vanished. The CIA quietly classified the entire book, sealed it inside a restricted archive, and left the public with nothing but rumours of a forbidden theory, too dangerous for ordinary people to know. Not because it revealed a secret weapon, not because it exposed a government scandal, but because it described the end of the world in such vivid detail that intelligence analysts decided it needed to be hidden. The book claimed that Earth's crust can suddenly slip, like a loose peel around an orange, and when it does, the continents don't drift. They rearrange themselves in hours. Oceans rise and become mountains of water miles high. Winds roar faster than sound. Volcanic fire pours across landscapes. Civilizations are destroyed so completely that humanity must crawl back from the Stone Age again and again. Thomas said we are not the first advanced civilization. We are the sixth, and each one before us was erased by the same unstoppable cycle. The CIA didn't deny this, they simply hid the book. But the strangest part, some of the evidence Thomas referenced, evidence once mocked as pseudoscience, has begun resurfacing in the modern world. The magnetic North Pole is drifting 40 metres per year. The Earth's magnetic field is weakening faster than anyone expected. Tsunami-sized mega ripples scar the Sahara. Mammoths have been found flash-frozen in mid-chew, and dozens of ancient cultures separated by oceans and millennia describe the same global cataclysm, a flood that arrived in one terrible day. And buried beneath all of this is another mystery. Why did the CIA care what this obscure engineer wrote? Why did they classify a book about geology and not unclassify it until 2013? And why does the released version look sanitized, with pages missing, dates off, and internal memos tucked inside that raise even more questions? Tonight we're going to open the file the CIA tried to bury. We're going to follow the evidence across continents, ancient myths, forgotten science, and modern data. And we're going to ask the one question that terrified intelligence agencies half a century ago. What if Earth has a reset switch? And what if it's overdue? The moment it vanished was small enough to miss. A niche West Coast publisher took delivery of a thin manuscript in early 1966, ran a modest print run, and started mailing copies to bookstores and libraries. Then men with government credentials began visiting those same locations. Clerks watched as the visitors checked inventory lists, pulled the title, and left few traces besides a receipt and a warning not to reorder. The book's remainder stock was collected. An internal stamp labelled it classified, and it dropped out of circulation without a public statement, peer review, or rebuttal. One week, a curiosity sat on a shelf. The next, it was treated as restricted material. Inside those seized pages, Thomas laid out a sequence that started with friction giving way. He argued the crust does not grip the layers beneath as tightly as we assume. In his model, a thin molten zone allows the outer shell to slip when balances are upset. The core keeps spinning. The shell breaks, slides, then locks again in a new orientation. The atmosphere, with its own momentum, does not stop just because land does. Air keeps moving over a halted surface, creating winds Thomas described at speeds that would scour soil, forests and cities. In that scenario, mountains do not move, but everything that clings to them does. The safe assumption of a steady sky breaks first. Water follows. Thomas said the oceans carry their forward motion onto land. Coastlines offer no defence when entire basins surge. He described waves not as storm surf but as travelling walls, rising thousands of feet in some basins, racing far inland and draining away to leave new shorelines. In the same hours, fractured crust vents magma through fresh rifts. Valleys become fire lines. Plains fracture into steam-belching fields. The sun's apparent motion warps when the crust rotates to a stop beneath a sky still moving. He said daylight can hang over one region for hours while another side endures an extended night, long enough to throw temperatures off a cliff and snap weather systems. He pushed the timeline hard. According to Thomas, this is not a slow rearrangement across ages. It is a mechanical failure cascading in hours. Rivers reverse for a time as gradients change. Ice loads collapse along fresh edges. Saltwater buries ancient soils under new layers. Survivors are not rebuilding after a storm. They are living on a different map. Navigation using past landmarks fails because past landmarks no longer match latitude, climate, or sea level. You do not plan a return to normal when normal is gone. The claim that made readers pause came next. He wrote that this cycle is repeated at least 6 times. Each time societies advance to a certain level, and the reset erases almost all trace beyond stone, bone, and story. In that view, our current moment is not the first rise. It is one in a sequence of attempts to rebuild with whatever survived the last catastrophic day. He tied the intervals to a rough cadence of thousands of years, with the last event recent enough to live in collective memory as flood lore and age of darkness legends. The point was not comfort. The point was that we are late in the cycle. That is the theory that disappeared. No public scientific panel tore into the mechanics. No journal hosted a debate. The response came as quiet removal and classification. Later, when a version surfaced, readers noticed gaps, blank leaves where content should be, and odd notations on surviving pages. Dates did not align cleanly with table of contents markers. A neat monograph looked like a working file that had passed through several hands. The result was not clarity, it was a fresh layer of doubt over whatever remained of the original argument. So why treat a geological speculation as sensitive? The practical Cold War answer would be that agencies collected anything that referenced mass casualty scenarios, global destabilization, or ideas that could spook populations. A book that puts a clock on civilization and sketches a fast path to collapse fits that category, even if the physics never convince a geophysicist. Classification does not equal endorsement. But classification does create a signal. Someone decided this belonged in a folder with limited access. Add a few missing pages and unexplained annotations, and the signal gets louder than the science. The paradox is that the act of burying the book made it harder to evaluate. A fringe idea could have faded on its own. Instead, removal turned it into contraband. Readers who managed to see copies before they were taken spread summaries. As the years passed, those summaries became the version most people knew, claims amplified at the edges. The more official silence persisted, the more rumours grew to fill the gaps. When an annotated, inconsistent release finally circulated, it raised even more questions about what had been there to begin with. The core of Thomas's story, stripped of rhetoric, is simple and brutal. The crust can slip. Momentum does not care. Air and water keep moving. The result is scouring winds, continent-scale floods, fire lines through fractures, and a reset. Not a metaphorical reset, a literal one, with calendars starting over because maps no longer match reality. He placed us late in the sequence. He suggested our infrastructure gives us speed, not safety. He did not ask permission to make the claim, and no one offered a public refutation before the book was pulled. Which brings us back to the first quiet knock on a bookstore door in 1966. Copies disappeared. A stamp went on a file. The author, already a defense industry insider, stepped into a different kind of spotlight he never controlled. And if that storyline sounds overblown for a slim volume on geophysics, then the next step makes more sense than it should. Look at the engineer himself, the one who designed missile guidance by day and chased high strangeness by night, and ask why an agency that rarely blinks at fringe ideas decided this time to put a lid on it. While cabinet rooms weighed megatons and missile trajectories, one quiet engineer was outlining a disaster no war room could plan for. Nuclear exchange had playbooks. What he described did not. He believed civilization's weak point wasn't a rival superpower, but the ground under our feet. Chan Thomas stepped into that world with credentials, not a tinfoil hat. He held real jobs in places that handled real budgets, real clearance badges and real deadlines. He trained in disciplines that punish sloppy thinking. He didn't lurk on the margins, he passed through the same secure doors as the era's mainstream engineers. That's the context often lost in the retelling. Before his name attached to apocalyptic cycles, it sat on corporate rosters at labs that pushed guidance systems and aerospace electronics forward under Cold War urgency. By day, he worked in domains that live and die by tolerances, missile guidance, control systems, and the mathematics that keep a payload where it's supposed to go. The culture of those programs runs on test data, failure reports, and incremental fixes. Yet his off-hours world looked nothing like an engineering change board. He published on ESP, he wrote about angels, he catalogued UFO accounts. It reads like two separate resumes bound into one person. At a time when most engineers stayed carefully inside their lanes, he stepped across them and started drawing lines between high technology and high strangeness. Those names on his resume matter: McDonnell Douglas, Bell Labs. These places screen for competence because mistakes ripple through hardware, contracts, and national strategy. Their projects touch classified briefings and procurement schedules. You don't get to linger there if you can't meet spec. Thomas did. That doesn't canonize his theories, but it does explain why his ideas weren't dismissed instantly inside the agencies that kept tabs on such circles. He had proximity to sensitive work, and that made his extracurricular interest part of a file someone might read twice. How does a man who helps aim missiles become preoccupied with ancient cataclysms? The contradiction is the point. Guidance systems teach you that small perturbations compound when a platform moves fast. He took that mindset and applied it to Earth systems, then widened the lens to history. If a guidance error crashes a vehicle, what does a planetary perturbation do to a civilization? He wasn't content to leave that thought on a napkin. He developed it into a manuscript that blended geophysics speculation, myth, and his own pattern-seeking instincts. He didn't keep his curiosity in the shadows either. Decades before social media turned fringe topics into a genre, he sat under studio lights and talked UFOs on national television. That matters because it put his name in front of the general public, and more importantly in front of compliance officers and security staff who watched broadcast transcripts as part of routine monitoring. His interest in non-standard topics wasn't a rumour on an office grapevine, it was on air. From his side of the desk, the classification that followed must have felt like a line crossed without explanation. Was the manuscript the trigger, or was the author the subject? If you hold a clearance and you publish a theory about global collapse mechanisms, someone in a cubicle will staple your work into a folder and write a short note. In this case, the folder later surfaced with details that don't read like a master plan. It read like a desk drawer. The declassified file tied to his book looks less like a single report and more like a bundle. Pages go blank where narratives should continue. Formatting shifts mid-document. A stray shopping list shows up next to pages about planetary resets. A clipped article from a popular magazine nestles against technical musings. None of this proves grand suppression. It suggests a working file, handled by a person who mixed routine office life with casework. Still, those oddities fed the idea that something sensitive lurked inside. That's the real tension. If Thomas was only a curious engineer with New Age side projects, why would any agency care? Because during the Cold War, attention wasn't endorsement. Agencies tracked what defense employees wrote, even when it was speculative, especially if it involved mechanisms, physics, or anything that could be conflated with active research. And they catalogued doomsday scenarios alongside the mundane to map out how ideas might spread. Thomas sat at the intersection of both. A contractor with a public profile who mailed a theory about civilizational collapse into the world. His background also made him difficult to pigeonhole. He could talk transfer functions and also publish on phenomena that modern labs don't measure. That duality created a person of interest, not in a criminal sense, but in a bureaucratic sense. You monitor edges because that's where leaks, misunderstandings, and public relations problems begin. If you're the custodian of national narratives about stability and preparedness, a book predicting cyclical resets of civilization deserves a bookmark even if you think it's wrong on the physics. So, was Thomas a visionary connecting deep time to living memory, or an engineer untethered from his training when he left the lab? The answer depends on which part of his output you weigh more heavily. His aerospace work speaks to competence. His paranormal and angelic research speaks to a mind drawn to patterns wherever they appear. The manuscript that bridged geology, myth, and catastrophe is what fused those halves into a single story that security officers couldn't ignore. And that brings us to the world he occupied when he wrote. In 1966, secrecy culture wasn't only about missiles and codes. It extended to anything that could move opinion, scramble morale, or be bent into psychological operations. You didn't need a warhead to be relevant. You needed a theory that travelled fast. In that climate, even geology could be framed as a weapon if it promised panic. Understanding Thomas means understanding that environment, where a manuscript could vanish from shelves not because it rewired physics, but because it pressed against the boundaries of what authorities wanted discussed in public, while the superpowers watched each other and waited. While sirens and fallout maps dominated the headlines, quiet offices inside American intelligence were building files on a different kind of annihilation. Events with no launch codes, no treaties, and no obvious enemy. Nuclear war was the fear you could point at. The other list, supervolcanoes, asteroid strikes, magnetic disturbances, runaway pandemics, crop failures from atmospheric dust, sat in drawers labelled with dates and cross-references, treated like any other potential mass casualty scenario that might push societies to the brink. The 1960s made that bookkeeping feel necessary. Defence contractors hired the brightest physicists and engineers in a world where secrets migrated through lunch conversations and conference abstracts. Background checks were routine, mail was screened. Manuscripts that touched on large-scale destruction or energy phenomena could set off a review even if they weren't scientific breakthroughs. The idea wasn't that geology itself was dangerous, but that knowledge, how people framed risk, how they imagined collapse, could move markets, elections, and military decisions. Inside that paranoia, agencies built catalogues, nuclear winter models, crop yield collapse after soot injection, tidal waves from undersea landslides, fault line cascades, near-Earth objects, and how often they miss. Files about myths were filed next to files about lab leaks and launch accidents. The job wasn't to endorse. It was to know what people were reading, saying, and circulating, especially if it touched a nerve the public already had. That made Chan Thomas pop on a radar screen. He wasn't mailing from a basement press with no return address. He worked around missile guidance and electromagnetics. An aerospace engineer discussing catastrophic Earth mechanics triggered the kind of automatic scrutiny applied to anyone with clearances or proximity to classified projects. Analysts didn't need to believe his cross-slipping world to justify logging it. They needed to assess whether someone with his background was building influence, attracting followers, or hinting at sensitive methods by analogy. Classification often functioned like a holding bin. A document could get stamped and shelved because it contained mass fatality speculation, because it circulated within a defense network, or because a reviewer wanted time to check references. None of that meant agreement. It meant the bureaucracy treated catastrophic narratives as potentially disruptive assets or liabilities. If a text described civilization-ending events in plain language and spread quickly, it could affect morale or encourage fatalism. In a Cold War built on perception, that mattered. Another layer sat under the paperwork: geopolitics. If rival states could seed or amplify stories about unstoppable natural resets, they might depress investment, scramble planning horizons, or nudge populations toward resignation. Rumours of cycles bigger than human effort can dampen the will to build shelters, maintain alliances, or finance long-term infrastructure. A theory that says cities will wash away in hours can be spun into a reason to abandon coastal bases, delay ports, or question leadership competence when contingency plans don't mention mile-high waves. Monitoring these narratives became part of countering psychological operations, even when the science was thin. Thomas's framing tapped a deep well of cultural stories. Flood epics exist across continents. Civilizations talk about ages that end and restart. That background gave his manuscript an easy way into public imagination. A technical voice connecting ancient cycles to modern risk could bridge myth and headline in a way leaflet campaigns never could. People accept patterns faster when they match what their grandparents said and what newscasters display as maps and models. Intelligence analysts track that kind of convergence because it changes how communities respond to warnings, rationing, evacuations, and news of distant disasters. The strategic question wasn't whether Earth's crust could skid in a day. It was how fast a story about inevitable collapse could move through universities, churches, town councils, and defence plants, and what it would make people do. Would workers care less about maintaining systems if they believed a reset was imminent? Would adversary push the narrative to sap confidence in civil defence or scientific institutions? Would fringe speculation borrow the language of classified programs, creating confusion about what the government knew? Each unknown justified another stamp and another file. In that environment, collecting doomsday scenarios looked like routine hygiene. If a text proposed global floods, winds, and instant erasure of cities, it landed in the same stack as asteroid impact briefings and pandemic tabletop exercises. Staff annotated margins for triggers, mass migration, energy grid failure, food shortages, rumour dynamics. They noted risk multipliers, elections, drought, strikes, foreign propaganda. They marked potential choke points, ports, refineries, data centres, pipelines, satellite constellations. The content might be wrong, but the behaviour it might provoke was measurable. Thomas's aerospace ties amplified those considerations. Engineers think in systems, feedbacks, tolerances, worst-case cascades. His manuscript built a system-level collapse that read like a failure analysis of the planet. That style translates well into planning documents, which made it legible to analysts trained on risk matrices. Even if they rejected the mechanism, they could map the knock-on effects: logistics cut, communications blind, command chains fractured, emergency services drowned, or, in a modern twist, paralysed by grid collapse long before any ocean moved. The details fed scenario builders who didn't need to believe the premise to extract actionable stress tests. And yet, all of this could stay buried under one simple administrative practice: when in doubt, limit circulation. Classification protected against overreaction as much as it shielded secrets. Keeping a vivid end of civilization narrative out of general channels reduced the chance it would be misread as a government warning. It also avoided the optics of public agencies appearing to validate apocalyptic timelines. The safest move was often to file it away and move on. That's how a small book about a catastrophic crust slip could end up in a Cold War archive next to memos, clippings, and odd inclusions that look random to anyone outside the process. The content was less important than the context: an anxious era, a defence-connected author, a narrative with psychological weight, and a bureaucracy trained to bottle narratives that could tilt public behaviour. Today, the secrecy that once wrapped that file is thinned. Decades later, the pages are visible. The mystique remains, but the text is there. The question shifts from why it was handled like a sensitive object to what it actually says when you read it line by line. After years of whispers, the declassified pages show what Thomas actually wrote in plain language. No second-hand rumours, no commentary. He lays out a direct ending for the world, not by comet or war, but by the ground under our feet letting go. He describes a planet that looks solid and steady, while underneath, the parts that matter most are in motion. That's the key. His scenario starts with the way Earth is built, and how that structure can fail without warning. Thomas's central premise is simple. The crust doesn't fuse to the deeper layers, it rides on top. He describes the lithosphere like a loose shell balanced on molten material beneath. Stability comes from equilibrium more than from a mechanical lock. That means the system can hold for long periods, then slip suddenly if the balance changes. According to him, Earth's surface rests in a precarious state, not a fixed one. When the balance tips, the shell moves. Not slowly, not in geologic ages, all at once. He says the ice caps are the destabilizer. As polar ice swells, mass gathers at the ends of the planet. That added weight, he argues, loads the crust unevenly. At a threshold that isn't predictable from the surface, the system fails. The shell of the Earth slips over the molten layer while the core keeps spinning. He stresses that the core's rotation does not change with the crust, which sets up the deadly mismatch that drives the rest of the disaster. The trigger is simple mass, growing quietly until the day it is not quiet. From there, Thomas walks through the chain reaction. The atmosphere keeps its rotation speed while the ground beneath stalls and shifts. That differential creates winds far beyond hurricane force. He describes airflow scouring continents, tearing away forests, soil, and anything not anchored deep in bedrock. He envisions surface structures stripped to foundations. He writes that this isn't a storm you ride out. It's a phase the planet passes through as the crust repositions, with air speeds that become the main force of destruction. The oceans become the second agent. Water carries momentum. When the ground lurches, seas surge past continental margins and onto land. Thomas describes them as moving walls, not waves you surf or boats outrun. He writes of coastlines vanishing in minutes, not eroding. Cities go under. Bays become temporary seabeds. There's no tide to wait out because the flow is driven by the whole planet's reorientation. He claims these walls of water reach miles in height as basins tilt and seawater redistributes. He then turns to the Earth itself, tearing. As the crust fractures under sudden stress, molten rock finds openings and rises. He describes volcanic curtains bursting across new rift lines, spreading fire into the shredded weather. Rivers reverse as gradients change. Water that once ran to one ocean now drains in the opposite direction. Sunlight appears wrong because your ground track has changed. He says the sun can look fixed overhead for hours in some regions while the shell slides, then seem to move in unfamiliar arcs as the world resettles. When the motion stops, the map is different. He writes that the aftershock isn't a set of quakes, but a broken compass for the survivors. Ice caps reform in new locations, storm tracks reorganize, latitudes that grew crops freeze, places that were tundra thaw into grassland. The few who make it through aren't only displaced, they're lost on a planet with shifted reference points. Thomas suggests that even knowing north becomes unreliable for a time. Navigation fails because the sky and the ground no longer match memory. He pushes this further with a claim that sets him apart. He says this is not a one-time accident, it's a cycle. He writes that it has happened at least 6 times before, each time scouring away advanced cultures so thoroughly that only fragments survive. Myths are the residue, in his view, the scattered memory of people trying to describe a day when the ocean stood up and the wind screamed. He doesn't frame legend as metaphor. He treats it as a record distorted by survival and time. Thomas puts a date on the last run. He places the previous reset at about 6,500 years ago. In his telling, that's recent enough to leave marks in the early stories and sudden starts in archaeology, yet far enough back to erase direct knowledge. He writes that we now stand near the next turn of the wheel. The implication is not a countdown clock, but a sense that our era sits in a repeating pattern, whose timing doesn't respect human plans. He ties the urgency of his work to that schedule. None of these ideas, he insists, came out of nowhere. He built them on earlier proposals that treated Earth as a system with moving parts and shifting poles. He read geologists who speculated on slipping crusts and ice-driven instability. and he points to a lineage of thinkers whose questions caught the attention of famous minds. Thomas saw himself as the one connecting scattered pieces into a single, stark mechanism. Whether that mechanism holds up is contested, but for the first time, those declassified pages let his version stand in his own words, setting the stage for the scientists who inspired him and the evidence he believed they left behind. Here's the twist almost no one expects. Thomas's end-of-the-world script didn't spring fully formed from a lone engineer's imagination. He borrowed scaffolding from a line of thinkers whose ideas once grazed respectable science. The most important of them was a soft-spoken college instructor with a wartime intelligence background who believed Earth's surface could slip like a loose skin. Before Thomas made it terrifying, Charles Hapgood made it sound plausible. Hapgood put forward a simple mechanical picture. Ice stacks up at the poles. That weight unbalances the planet. The outer shell, resting over a hotter, more ductile interior, shifts to restore balance. In his telling, continents wouldn't creep, they'd lurch. Climate zones would be reassigned in one dramatic move. By the 1950s, he had stitched his case from old charts, climate puzzles, and stories of lands that didn't match the weather they supposedly had. He was not a geologist by training, but he worked methodically, collecting anomalies and treating them like evidence. What gave his pitch staying power was who nodded at it. Albert Einstein wrote the foreword to Hapgood's book. It didn't crown the theory correct, but it gave the author a kind of halo. If a cautious mind could sit with the idea long enough to introduce it, then maybe it deserved a hearing. That credibility helped the theory circulate in the same circles Thomas later moved through, where aerospace engineers, defense analysts, and curious academics traded fringe models alongside mainstream breakthroughs. Hapgood's dossier leaned on three pillars. First, a cluster of early modern maps that appeared to show coastlines and continental outlines with puzzling precision. The Piri Reis map became the showpiece, with claims that it hinted at an Antarctica coastline without ice. Second, he pointed to geological mismatches, evidence that climates once suited forests where tundra sits today, and fossils that suggested rapid relocations of temperature belts. Third, he invoked the reality of supercontinents. If Pangaea and Gondwana once existed, then Earth had a track record of wholesale rearrangement. To him, the only question was tempo, slow drift or sudden shift. Modern geology resolved the how with a framework Hapgood didn't have. Plate tectonics explains that the crust breaks into pieces riding the mantle's slow convection. Mountains rise where plates collide. Oceans open where they pull apart. Seafloor spreads at measured rates. Magnetic stripes on the ocean floor record reversals as tape marks time. The system needs millions of years, not hours. Continental motion isn't a runaway skateboard. It's an escalator that never speeds up. And yet, Hapgood's instincts weren't all misplaced. Earth does realign in other ways. True polar wander, where the whole solid Earth shifts relative to its spin axis, has occurred on long timescales. Continents have indeed roamed vast distances. The surface has endured reorganizations big enough to reset ecosystems and ocean currents. The difference lies in pacing and mechanism. Rather than an ice-weighted shell sliding free, the mantle's slow churn and plate boundaries set the schedule. This is where Thomas stepped in. He took Hapgood's broad outline and set a clock that ticks in days. He added the atmosphere's inertia and the ocean's momentum as multipliers. In his version, the wind keeps moving while the land jerks, and the sea keeps rushing while the shoreline breaks. Hapgood's cold imbalance becomes Thomas's global scouring. Now place that model against current measurements. We track the magnetic poles with satellites and field stations. The North Magnetic Pole is not sitting still. It's moving on the order of tens of meters per year, approaching roughly 40 meters annually in recent decades. That's not crust moving. It's the field shifting, rooted in the liquid outer core's changing flows. Our magnetic shield has also weakened over the last 2 centuries. Again, that's a core phenomenon, not a crustal sprint. But it shows a dynamic interior, not a locked machine. Ice cores add another layer. They capture abrupt climate jumps. In Greenland, records show temperature swings that happen far faster than old models allowed. Global circulation can pivot within decades. Meltwater pulses reorganize currents. Regions flip from cold to mild on human timescales. Those are not one-day world flips, but they're quick enough to stress societies and redraw coastlines. The planet can change faster than comfortable planning horizons. Even the supercontinent story carries a quiet echo of Hapgood's hunch. We know now that continents gather and scatter in cycles. The engine is slow, but the outcomes are radical. If you only saw the before and after snapshots, you might infer a sudden move. With continuous data, the motion is steady, patient, relentless. The crucial disagreement remains the slip. Modern Earth models don't support a free lubricated crust that can shear over a molten layer in a day. There isn't a global, thin, slippery film waiting to fail. The lithosphere is coupled to the mantle, its strength varies, and it fractures along known boundaries. Sudden planet-wide displacement doesn't have a physical home in these models. Local catastrophes, however, are well attested. Mega floods from glacial dam failures, massive eruptions, abrupt droughts, and storms intensified by reorganized oceans. Still, the list of present instabilities keeps attention on the interior. The South Atlantic hosts a broad magnetic weak zone where satellites take extra radiation hits. Field maps require updates more often than they used to. Navigators and power grid operators watch space weather forecasts closely. The field's variability is measurable, and that alone invites hard questions about exposure and risk that earlier generations didn't have to ask. So we're left with a layered verdict. Hapgood sampled mysteries and offered a bold, wrong mechanism but a useful provocation. Earth can rearrange itself. Thomas dramatized that idea into a clockwork catastrophe. Plate tectonics rejected the lurch and affirmed the journey. Meanwhile, our instruments keep reminding us that the planet's core, field, and climate talk to each other in ways we still don't fully map. If respected names once entertained a sliding shell, and today's data show magnetic acceleration and a declining shield, the next step is obvious. We have to look at what current research says about stability, timing, and what sort of disruptions are actually on the table now. Here's the reality check that pulls us out of speculation and into numbers. The magnetic North Pole is moving faster now than at any point in recorded history. The drift today is on the order of tens of meters each year, closing in on 40 meters annually. That speed matters because modern life hangs on where that pole actually is, not where charts say it should be. The pole used to crawl. Now it hustles across the top of the world, and every system that leans on magnetism has to keep up. Navigation isn't a compass and a map anymore. Airlines set runway headings by magnetic bearing. Surveyors align infrastructure to models of the field. Smartphones and drones reference magnetic north to stabilize flight and orientation. Military operations layer targeting, communications and mapping on top of global magnetic models. Those models used to update on a predictable schedule. Now they need refreshes more often than planned because the field keeps changing faster than expected. A quiet tweak to a spreadsheet becomes rerouted flights, recalibrated instruments, and software patches pushed worldwide. The acceleration itself is the mystery. Early in the 20th century, the North Pole's drift sat closer to 10 meters per year. By the 2000s, it moved about 4 times that pace. The cause is not settled. Scientists map the field from satellites, research vessels, and ground stations, then back out what must be happening in the liquid outer core to produce what we measure at the surface. The numbers fit the observations, but the engine room remains off limits. We infer flows of molten iron, shifting patches of stronger and weaker field and complex feedbacks. We don't have a single, simple driver that explains the jump in speed. At the same time, the field's overall strength has been stepping down. Measurements over the past 2 centuries show about a 10% decline, and the downturn continues. That loss matters because the magnetic field is a shield. It deflects charged particles from the sun. When the shield weakens, more energy couples into near-Earth space. That coupling can disturb satellite electronics, heat the upper atmosphere, and drive electrical currents in long conductors at the surface. Power grids, pipelines, and undersea cables feel those currents in ways their designers didn't always anticipate. One place makes the vulnerability obvious. Over South America and the South Atlantic sits a weak patch known as the South Atlantic Anomaly. Satellites report more radiation hits there, so operators shut down or harden sensitive equipment when passing overhead. This zone is not static. It drifts and morphs, and in recent tracking it has split into two lobes. That split complicates flight planning for spacecraft and increases error budgets for instruments. The anomaly doesn't break the system, it erodes margins, and in systems engineering, eroded margins stack up. Ground truth also reminds us that Earth's orientation is not a fixed constant. Major earthquakes redistribute mass, and mass distribution affects rotation. After the 2004 Indonesian earthquake and the 2011 event off Japan, precise measurements showed tiny changes in day length and a slight shift in the geographic pole. We're talking milliseconds and centimetres, but the point stands. The planet behaves like a rotating system with internal parts that move and transfer momentum. Nothing about it is locked in place. All of this builds a paradox for anyone expecting Thomas's version of an instant crustal slide. The magnetic pole's sprint, the weakening field, the South Atlantic Anomaly's growth and bifurcation, and the quake-induced nudges to rotation are measurable and real. They do not point to continents slamming to a halt while the air keeps moving at 1,000 miles an hour. They show a world that never stops adjusting, responding, and rebalancing. It's a series of small, persistent changes that add up to operational challenges, not a single-day reset. Yet the measurements raise as many questions as they settle. Why did the pole's speed pick up when it did? How far will field strength fall before it stabilizes? What flow patterns in the core produce the South Atlantic Anomaly's twin lobes? How do changes in the field couple to the upper atmosphere and then down into ground systems during severe solar events? These are live research topics because the answers inform satellites, power grids, aviation, and navigation. We instrument the planet because we have to, not because it's a curiosity. There's also a practical edge to the numbers. Airports repaint runway numbers to match moving magnetic headings. Survey catalogues get revised so construction projects don't inherit small errors that become big costs. Grid operators monitor space weather because geomagnetic disturbances can drive currents that saturate transformers. Engineers design satellites with extra shielding or duty cycles that power down sensors over weak field regions. These are tactical adjustments to a strategic trend. The field is changing faster than our old schedules assumed. The consensus remains clear on one point. Full geomagnetic reversals take thousands of years. They don't flip in a day, and they're not the same as suddenly sliding the crust over the mantle. That distinction matters. It separates what we can measure and plan around from a scenario that would outpace any response. But it doesn't remove the sense that we live on a moving target. Models that used to hold for 5 years now need mid-cycle corrections. The quiet background becomes another variable to manage. All of this creates an unexpected bridge. When you see instruments recalibrated, runways renumbered, satellites dodging radiation hotspots, and power grids watching the sky, you start to wonder how earlier societies recorded what they experienced when the world around them changed quickly. If the instruments today are our logs, the stories of the past were theirs, and if water, sky, and ground can shift enough to force course corrections now, it's worth asking whether ancient accounts of overwhelming floods carry more than myth, preserved as memory across generations. Across 6 continents, more than 40 cultures wrote down the same kind of disaster. The world floods, almost everyone dies, and a tiny group restarts everything. That number alone is hard to explain with coincidence. These stories appear in places with no shared language, no known contact, and timelines spaced by centuries. Yet their core plotlines match with uncomfortable precision. Water rises fast, seas invade the land. A chosen survivor builds a vessel or flees to high ground. Afterward, the world begins again with new rules, a new sky, and a new order. Most people know the version in Genesis, but the Bible's account has an older shadow. A millennium before that text, a Sumerian king in the Epic of Gilgamesh learns from Utnapishtim about a world-drowning flood and a boat loaded with life. The scene turns on divine warning, a frantic construction, and release of birds to find land after the waters fall. The details differ, but the spine is the same. The deluge wipes the slate. What surprises scholars is not a single lineage of influence, but the breadth of matching stories far beyond the Near East. On islands in the middle of the Pacific, Hawaiian tradition tells of Nu, a man who builds a great canoe to ride out water that overtops the mountains. In Mesoamerica, Maya texts describe cyclical destructions where water and sky overturn the world between ages. In China, the tale of Great Yu centres on a country-swallowing flood that requires engineering more than prayer, with channels cut and courses redirected to tame the chaos. Across North America, tribes tell of waves high as peaks, animals fleeing uphill, and survivors guided by birds or spirit signs. The range of terrain and climate here is huge, yet these stories share the same rhythm: a sudden rise, a world stripped back, and a restart from a remnant. The consistency runs deeper than a lot of rain. Many of these accounts describe seas invading the continents, not storms from above. They recall people clinging to floating trees, rafts, or hollowed logs. They often include a warning that arrives just in time to save a single family or a tiny circle of people. The aftermath has common beats too: a darkened sky, ash or silt covering fertile land, and rules handed down for a new era. Even the moral lessons rinse and repeat: pride, chaos, punishment, survival, renewal, like echoes of the same source event filtered through different languages. Archaeology has found hard evidence of floods that don't fit ordinary river overflow. Around 7,000 years ago, the Black Sea appears to have expanded rapidly when rising seas breached a natural barrier, swallowing shorelines and reshaping coasts. In the Mediterranean, research points to mega-flood episodes in earlier periods, where water masses moved through narrow straits and basins at speeds that gouged the seabed. In North America's Pacific Northwest, Ice Age glacial lakes once broke their dams and unleashed walls of water that ripped out coulees, carved giant dry falls, and laid down fields of gravel in single episodes. These are not fantasy events, they're etched into rock. The Younger Dryas remains the standout mystery for sudden change. About 12,800 years ago, the Northern Hemisphere snapped back into cold conditions. The shift arrived quickly on geological timescales and ended with a rapid melt that raised sea levels and poured fresh water into the oceans. Whether the trigger was internal dynamics, meltwater routing, or something external, the result was a set of floods and climate swings well beyond any modern baseline. The scale of rearrangement following that cold snap could seed memories that persist in oral histories for thousands of years. The timing gets uncomfortable when you map stories to sediments. Chan Thomas placed his last cycle around 6,500 years ago. Independent of any pole shift claims, multiple flood markers sit in the 6,500 to 7,000 year window. The Black Sea expansion, post-glacial sea level still rising into new lowlands, and floodplain reorganisation across parts of Europe and Asia. Several Chinese legends gained fresh attention when fieldwork identified remains of a major landslide dam flood along the Yellow River dated to a similar range. These aren't proof of a global ocean surfacing in a day, but they do confirm that regional apocalypses were real, recent in deep time, and easily devastating enough to reboot local cultures. There is also the way communities encode survival knowledge inside story frames. Boat building, hilltop refugees, and seed saving appear as ritual instructions. The stories often end with a covenant not to repeat old mistakes, but the practical thread, how to live near water that can turn on you, reads like a manual. When you see the same motifs in the Andes, the Levant, Polynesia and the Arctic, the possibility grows that these are memories of specific events, not literary tropes travelling along trade routes. Skeptics point out that humans live near water, so floods will be common. True, but catastrophic floods that redraw maps and raise crop systems are rare enough to stand out for millennia. Oral tradition preserves sharp edges when the event is traumatic and teaches a rule that helps descendants survive. A wave the size of a mountain is not a frequent exaggeration across dozens of languages, unless people saw water that high, relative to their local terrain. Put side by side, the myths and the sediments start to rhyme. Regional deluges with continental impact can account for a chorus of flood stories without invoking a single, world-spanning ocean cresting overnight. Yet the clustering of legends, the precision of certain details, and the alignments with dated hydrologic shocks leave an open door. People saw something, remembered it, and taught it. If water can hold memory inside song and story, stone should hold it in scours and monuments. And in Egypt, there's a lion-bodied sentinel with weathering no one can agree on, guarded by walls that look older than the desert around them. Stone holds its own weather report. Walk up to the Great Sphinx and the enclosure around it, and the limestone tells a story that doesn't match 5,000 years of desert. The body sits in a hollow carved from the bedrock, and those walls don't show sharp, sand-chiseled faces. They roll and curve, the channels cut down in soft arcs, like stone that softened under long, steady rain. That's the first fracture in the neat timeline. If those curves come from water, they point to a climate Egypt hasn't seen since deep prehistory. This is where the fight begins. Mainstream Egyptologists place the Sphinx around 2500 BC, tied to Khafra's pyramid complex. The quarry marks, the alignment of temples, the style, these form a coherent package. But geologist Robert Schoch walked the trench and focused only on the rock. He argued those vertical, rounded gullies are consistent with repeated rainfall over centuries, not wind-driven sand. If that reading is right, the Sphinx enclosure was exposed to weather when the Sahara wasn't a Sahara. That would push the original carving thousands of years earlier into a time before dynastic kings and formal hieroglyphs. The counter-argument is clear. Wind and salt exfoliation can sculpt stone in odd ways, and the monument has seen millennia of repair. Egypt's plateau carries a patchwork of limestone layers, some hard and some crumbly. Erosion can look different within a few steps. Archaeologists point to tool marks, the broader context of Old Kingdom engineering, and inscriptions nearby that support the standard date. But Schoch's analysis keeps tugging at the thread. The enclosure walls show a pattern that runs deeper than wind pitting. Broad undulations, vertical channels that swell and taper, rounded edges that suggest water runoff from above, not lateral abrasion by blowing sand. Then there's the Sphinx's head, which many note looks small for the body. The headrock is harder, and the face shows sharper toolwork than the eroded flanks. Some researchers propose the head was recarved in later times, which would mask earlier tool marks. If the body predates the Old Kingdom, and the head was reshaped to match a later ruler's iconography, that would explain the mismatch. It would also mean we're looking at a monument with two birthdays, an ancient torso from a wetter world and a younger face recut in a pharaoh's image. Walk the enclosure and the same watery signature appears on multiple walls. The curves continue even where wind exposure would differ, hinting the agent didn't blow from one direction but fell from above. Egypt's heavy rains belong to a climate regime that ended long before Khafre. If that's correct, we're forced to ask who carved a 240-foot-long body from bedrock in an era when archaeology doesn't expect large-scale stone projects at all. The inventory stealer, often cited in this debate, complicates things by implying the Sphinx was already old in later times, though its reliability remains contested. If taken at face value, it adds one more clue that maintenance followed memory. Under the pores, ground-penetrating surveys have flagged cavities and voids. They could be natural pockets in a karstic limestone. They could be ancient chambers. Without full access and excavation, those echoes remain only that. Shapes in a scan, fuel for speculation that records of an earlier builder lie sealed below. The Sphinx's orientation, facing due east, anchors it to the sunrise at the equinoxes. Some extend that to a link with the constellation Leo in deep antiquity. Egyptologists reply that solar alignment suits an Old Kingdom sun cult as well, so the sky offers alignment, but not a date stamp. Now widen the lens. In southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe shows T-shaped pillars with relief carvings arranged in circles dated to roughly 11,000 years ago. It's monumental architecture before widespread agriculture, which upends the old assumption that farms came first, then cities, then temples. Off India's coast, sonar surveys and divers report rectilinear features on submerged shelves, intriguing but contested. Natural formations can mimic steps and blocks, and provenience is difficult underwater. Still, the pattern is consistent. Sites that demand we revisit how quickly complex organisation and stonework emerged after the last ice age. These anomalies do not prove an advanced lost global culture. They do insist on a timeline that isn't as tidy as once taught. If the Sphinx's enclosure truly carries rainfall erosion, then a major stone project landed in a climate window that predates the Nile's historic drought. If Göbekli Tepe stands where hunter-gatherers raised megaliths before fields, then social coordination existed earlier than expected. Put them side by side and the question shifts from, did a single lost civilization do this, to how many early experiments in complexity have we missed? This is where Thomas's reset idea re-enters, not as proof, but as a frame. If cycles of environmental upheaval punctuate human development, a long-lived stone guardian could outlast libraries, cities, and the names of its makers. The Sphinx then reads as a survivor, weathered by a climate that does not match our written record. It hints at a chapter in which people organised labour at a scale we didn't think possible that early, only to lose the scaffolding of their world to drought, flood, or social collapse. The rock keeps the trace while the stories thin to myth. One monument can be an outlier, but when outliers start stacking, rain-carved enclosures in desert Egypt, megaliths older than farming, submerged geometries where coastlines used to be, the burden shifts to explanation. Either geology, archaeology, and dating methods carry blind spots in specific contexts, or the early Holocene saw more cultural experimentation than our current record preserves. A drier Sahara erased vegetation and soil, rising seas erased coastal plains, time erased wood, cloth, and clay. Stone stayed, carrying the weather it met, so we move from a single statue to a broader canvas. If one monument can confuse our clock, what happens when whole regions do? Beyond individual blocks and trenches, some landscapes bear scars that look like motion frozen in place, ripples, channels, and rings that hold the shape of force. The next step is to leave the Giza Plateau and ask whether a full geological basin might store the outline of a city, described in an old story and erased in a single terrible day. Plato gave a clean blueprint, a city built as rings of land and water, precise in proportion, destroyed in a single day by flood and fire. Set that image aside for a moment. In the Western Sahara, satellites reveal a circular formation so large you only catch its shape from space. Concentric bands, wide as cities, lying in an area of desert that once held far more water than it does today. The formation has a name now, the Eye. Its symmetry is striking. Its edges trace out circles that bring to mind those old lines. And once you see the layout, it's hard to unsee the match. Rings, raised margins, and channels that align with the old story's geometry. The Eye drew the attention of space agencies because it stands out from orbit. Up close, it's a weathered dome. From above, it looks designed. The structure's salt deposits mark a past with seawater present, and traces of an ancient river draining West Point to a landscape that moved water at scale. Mainstream geology calls it a deeply eroded uplift, shaped by wind and time. That fits much of what's visible. But the concentric order raises questions that a simple erosion story doesn't fully resolve. Why the long, even arcs? Why the layered ring pattern that repeats at large scale? The answers lean toward natural processes that can create circular forms, yet the pattern's clarity keeps the debate alive. Step outside the eye and the terrain starts to tell a louder story. Across northwest Africa, satellite imagery shows sets of ripples cut into the land. Regular parallel ridges that extend for miles. Some rise as high as a multi-story building. Regular rain doesn't lay down features like that. Rivers don't either, not at that scale and uniform spacing across such breadth. They look like the result of water moving as a sheet with force, the kind of flow that drags sediment in cords and stacks it in rhythmic bars. It suggests fast, high-energy water surges crossing open ground, not localized floods. And these ripples align with channels that point toward the Atlantic, as if something pushed vast volumes westward in a short window. The paradox deepens when you look for traces of the sea. Marine fossils appear in places where waves haven't rolled in living memory. Dry channels slice through the eye's rings and exit toward older river paths, mapping routes that no longer carry water. Drone footage shows sweeping flow lines, converging fans, and scour marks in the lowlands around the structure. If the Sahara had only been dry for millennia, this scale of waterwork would not sit on the surface so fresh. The evidence points to episodic wet phases, punctuated by events that moved water like heavy machinery across a plain. Now draw a line back to the book that started this investigation. Thomas wrote about oceans climbing onto land in walls that strip surfaces bare. If that ever happened in northwest Africa, you'd expect to see signatures, long ripples set like corduroy, channels cut straight through resistant margins, and basins filled with salt. Around the eye, you find each of those elements. The circular geometry sits like a target in the centre of terrain that looks scraped and rinsed in arcs. The landscape reads like an aftermath, the kind of wide area pattern you get when water isn't confined to riverbanks, but moves in sheets driven by momentum, then drains off and leaves ribs behind. None of that proves an ancient city stood there, nor that a single-day collapse erased it. The eye functions as a natural formation under standard models. But if you're testing a reset hypothesis, this is where the physical clues stack up. A ringed structure tied to broad-scale water scars, a desert that records marine presence, and flow features that point to extreme, not gradual, hydraulics. The connections create a bridge between myth and material, a story of circular harbours and a real-world set of circular bands embedded in a flood-shaped field. The eye isn't the only node in this network. As soon as you widen the map, you run into a different ocean and an older rumour. Pull the focus to the Pacific, where oral histories and texts speak of a drowned homeland, a place with cities stretched across island arcs and a fall by water and fire. The term for that lost world changes with the language, but the pattern holds. Underwater, structures sit on ledges where sea levels once stood lower. In Micronesia, basalt columns stack into man-made island platforms that rise from shallow lagoons, forming a complex of waterways and walls that hint at a detailed plan. It's the kind of engineering that requires coordination, material knowledge, and a long memory of tides and storms. Much of it now lies close to or beneath the waterline. Further west, arguments continue over stepped stone forms sitting below waves off a rugged coast, terraces and ledges that look too regular to dismiss without a closer study. If any of these sites were built when shoreline sat hundreds of feet lower, the timelines move back into the last glacial retreat, where meltwater pulses and rising seas would have eaten coastlines fast. Across this ocean, you find stonework that resists easy dating, languages with common roots spanning island chains, and genetics that tell of long voyaging. The water makes it harder to keep archives. Storms erase, waves redistribute. What remains is usually heavy and simple: basalt columns, carved blocks, aligned platforms. The thread that ties the Sahara's Eye to this Pacific puzzle is not proof of a single lost empire. It's the recurrence of a physical motif, circular or monumental geometry set in landscapes that have undergone major water movement. When you take that motif seriously, you start looking for consistent signs: erosion that indicates fast flow, sediments stacked in large rhythmic forms, and salt where deserts now stand. That approach sets up the next step toward the wider Pacific problem, where legends of a sunken homeland meet stone that still stands, and where the ocean's rise becomes a working mechanism rather than a metaphor. We leave the Sahara behind and cross the biggest stage on Earth. The Pacific is wide enough to swallow continents and deep enough to erase them. That's where the story of Mu lives. Not a Victorian fantasy tacked onto Atlantis, but a supposed motherland told in Indian and Maya sources, later amplified by writers who claimed a civilization spread across a chain from Japan to Easter Island. The version that survives describes a place built before the seas rose, a culture with seafaring reach and cities on coral shelves, ended by a pair of killers that show up in every old story: water and fire. If that sounds like myth, it also reads like a memory of coastlines that once sat hundreds of feet lower than they do now, when a drowned world had room for cities where the seabed lies today. The first hard turn in this ocean map came in 1986, when divers near Yonaguni, off Japan's far southwest, swam onto a stepped complex that looks precise in all the ways natural formations avoid. Long, straight edges, right-angled corners, broad stair-like terraces that descend into deeper water, with ramps that seem to lead nowhere now. If it's entirely natural, it's a geological coincidence stacked upon coincidence. If it's even partly shaped by people, then it sits in a timeline that doesn't fit our model. This site stands underwater because sea level rose more than 300 feet after the last glacial maximum. That pushes any human work back to a window when shorelines ran far beyond their modern outlines. In that case, someone had both the time and the skill to cut vast surfaces and control geometry long before temples rose in stone on land we can still walk today. Skeptics point out that sandstone fractures can split into neat planes and currents can sharpen edges. They're right, nature can carve symmetry. But divers and researchers have highlighted features that complicate that answer. Flat platforms that hold consistent height across spans larger than a building, steps uniform enough to act like rows in an amphitheatre, and channels that trace straight paths instead of meandering. No single detail settles the matter. The accumulation keeps the debate alive. Move southeast and the trail reaches Micronesia, where Nan Madol sits astride a reef like a city poured into a chessboard. It spans nearly 100 islets, each edged by basalt columns stacked like logs, some weighing dozens of tons, set into walls that corral canals. The engineering raises two questions. First, transport. Basalt prisms do not float. Second, planning. The complex routes tide and flow with an accuracy that implies generational knowledge of currents and foundations. Local oral history does not claim its construction as recent work. By the time European observers wrote about it, the builders were already unknown. Archaeologists date portions to the last millennium, yet the techniques suggest an older tradition. If coastal engineering existed on Pacific atolls in deep prehistory, its traces would rest where coral and silt now cover everything. Turn further east and land at Rapa Nui, Easter Island. The statues we all know don't stop at the neck. Digging revealed full bodies sunk in layers of sediment, some more than 30 feet tall, with bedrock sockets and back carvings that stayed hidden for centuries. Those layers line up with long-term deposition. They point to hills that slumped, soils that moved, and a landscape that buried its icons without human intent to do so. You don't entomb your own monuments on purpose. Your environment does the burying. That implies a period when windblown material and wash filled the island's low spots much faster than normal, then stabilised, leaving only heads above ground until modern work exposed the rest. Across this ocean, the themes repeat. You find stone set at a scale that strains local materials and tools. You see water control where water rules everything. And you hear stories that carry maps in metaphor. Homelands lost to flooding, fire from the sky, gods angry at hubris, survivors steering by stars to start again somewhere that stayed dry. None of it proves a single continent named morose and sank in one blow. But the archipelago of clues forms a kind of negative space on a chart. If shorelines shift by hundreds of feet, and if people cluster along coasts, as they always do, then the largest eraser on the planet sits exactly where these memories point. The Pacific hides what it takes. It does not keep libraries, it keeps stone. Genetics and language add a quieter layer to this picture. Polynesian voyages mapped the ocean with oral navigation. Patterns in DNA track family lines that spread in waves across islands separated by thousands of miles. Austronesian languages carry shared roots from Taiwan down through Micronesia and out to Rapa Nui. Architectural habits travel with people too. Terracing, platform building, basalt column use, and the placement of ceremonial centres in relation to stars. When traditions jump that far and still rhyme, they hint that skills survived disaster by moving with bodies in boats rather than staying anchored to ground that later drowned. Seen as a network rather than a single spot on a globe, Mu turns from continent to corridor. It becomes a chain of high places that stayed above water and low shelves that did not, all linked by voyagers who had reasons to remember lost lands. That view aligns with sea level curves after the last ice age. During the meltwater pulses, coastlines retreated fast, swallowing shelf after shelf, cutting off land bridges and isolating communities that had been neighbours. If towns stood on flat terraces now under 30 metres of water, we would miss them, unless we went looking with sonar and time. And even then, the Pacific is wide enough to hide 1,000 Yonagunis. There's one more link to Thomas's reset theme buried here, but it's not on a map. It's in what violent change does to flesh. If a world can flood a valley in days, it can also drop temperatures in hours, and it can capture life in the act. The next step leans into evidence that doesn't need legends or megaliths to stay intact. It stays intact because it froze before it could rot, and it froze fast. They didn't thaw out in neat museum conditions. Teams pulled them from collapsing riverbanks and thawing permafrost, tusks jutting from mud like fallen trees. The first reports shocked early researchers precisely because of what the bodies still held. The Berezovka mammoth, recovered in Siberia in 1900, had a mouthful of grasses and buttercups jammed between its teeth. Muscles and soft tissue survived. A foreleg was broken, as if the animal had been caught mid-movement. Later finds repeated the pattern. The Ukagir mammoth's front half preserved heavy tissue, with stomach material that still showed blades of grass. These details imply a living animal foraging in temperate conditions that met fatal cold quickly enough to halt digestion and preserve soft tissue that normally rots within hours. That creates a hard problem. An animal this large carries massive thermal inertia. To stop decay and lock plant fibres in place inside the mouth and gut, temperature has to fall fast enough to outpace bacterial action and enzymatic breakdown. Gradual glacial cooling doesn't do that. Seasonal cold doesn't either. The preservation suggests a rapid shift from above freezing to well below freezing in a very short window. Even if local burial contributed, the combination of undigested food, intact soft tissue, and body position points to a catastrophe measured in hours, not centuries. When you pull back from one carcass and look at the planet's record, the abruptness theme repeats. Greenland ice cores reveal climatic jumps called Danskard-Ushka events. In these, temperatures climbed or fell by double digits in a matter of decades. That is fast on a global scale and destabilizing for ecosystems and ice sheets. Then there's the Younger Dryas. Around 12,800 years ago, the northern hemisphere slipped back into near glacial conditions after warming had started. The onset was sudden, not the gentle gradient often associated with Ice Age shifts. It happened on a timescale that would look like a step function on a long chart. One attempt to explain that step proposes an external trigger. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis argues that fragments from space detonated over or impacted large ice sheets. Airbursts could have vaporized surface water and organic matter, lit fires across regions, and dumped dust into the atmosphere. That chain would darken skies, reflect sunlight, and accelerate cooling, while the sudden input of meltwater would disrupt ocean circulation. Whether or not this mechanism accounts for the entire event, it demonstrates that the planet can experience rapid, global-scale changes through short-lived forcing. You don't need a millennium of drift to get a climate shock. The ground still holds traces of violent transitions. Many Siberian mammoths lie within mixed sediment that looks like fast deposition rather than slow build-up. Bones twist and turn in ways consistent with transport, as if bodies were swept and dumped into low basins, then sealed by a freeze that arrived before scavengers and decay could do their work. In some regions, lake beds carry forms that resemble processes abandoned mid-construction, ripple marks locked in by sudden cold, channels cut and then stilled. The arrangement matches a sequence where water moves, surges, and then loses energy abruptly while the thermometer collapses. That pairing of flood action and freezing speaks to an event cascade. You get meltwater release, ice dam failure, or sudden precipitation as vapour condenses in a destabilized atmosphere. Water races across plains and into valleys, entrains sediment and carcasses, and then, instead of a slow taper, everything snaps cold. In that scenario, the plant fragments in a mammoth's mouth make more sense. The animal feeds on open ground. A shock hits. Wind, debris, pressure wave or ground motion, and within hours conditions cross thresholds that turn wetlands into ice traps. This is where Thomas's cycle slips back into view, not as proof, but as a lens. He argued that resets come with atmospheric chaos, global floods, and rapid climate flips. The paleontological record does not require his entire crust-slipping mechanism to generate the outcomes he described. You can assemble a reset-like profile from known processes, a high-energy atmospheric event, regional or continental floods, sudden temperature drops recorded in ice cores, and a biological die-off concentrated in species already stressed by changing habitat. That profile aligns with preserved megafauna, scorched layers some researchers tie to firestorms, and sediment packages that speak of speed. Consider the logistics of preservation again. For digestive contents to remain identifiable, you need both immediate cooling and physical protection. Freezing stops microbes, burial blocks oxygen and scavengers. The two together can happen if floodwaters carry an animal downslope into fine sediment, and then a cold plunge hits before churning resumes. The broken limb on the Berezovka specimen supports the idea of sudden trauma. The well-kept plant matter points to minimal time between feeding and death. The soft tissue tells you decay never got a foothold. Ice cores give the timing backbone. If the air's composition and isotope ratios jump within a generation, ecosystems don't have time to track the change. Herbivores follow grasses across wide ranges, predators follow herbivores. A hot-cold switch strands them. Rivers reverse flow during outburst floods. Basins that drained become traps. If, on top of that, skies dim from dust or stratospheric aerosols, temperatures fall further. In such a stack, it's not hard to imagine an entire region shifting from summer pasture to lethal freezer in a single season, with a day or two doing the fatal work. None of this proves a wholesale crust displacement. It does, however, show that Earth can produce the kind of abrupt, multi-system shock that Thomas described happening within one long day. A mechanism that moves faster than biology and faster than cultural memory can process leaves behind exactly this kind of evidence. Half-eaten meals, muscles intact, bones tangled in flood-laid silts, and landforms that look like actions paused mid-stroke. And if sudden cold and surging water belong in the same frame, then the next step is to ask whether the planet's internal dynamics could sink those forces, which is where the theory of sliding shells and shifting poles enters the conversation next. Thomas drew a hard line between slow geology and what he called a mechanical failure. In his view, the crust rides on a thin molten layer beneath, not locked but floating, and that layer behaves like a lubricant. Under normal conditions, he said, the system holds steady because the planet's interior maintains a kind of magnetic and electrical order. That order keeps the crust gripping enough to move gently over time. The failure begins when that order breaks down. Then the lubricant stops behaving like a stiff, syrupy medium and loosens into something that can slide. That is the key difference. Not gradual drift, but a slip event. His trigger focuses on ice loading. Ice caps, he argued, don't grow evenly. They pile up more on one side than another, adding an off-center weight to the shell. Over tens of thousands of years, that offset builds torque against the crust. The planet's rotation keeps turning like a flywheel. Most of the mass below stays aligned, but the shell at the top is now carrying a lopsided burden. Once the internal locking weakens, the crust yields. The result in his model is abrupt displacement, not by inches per year, but by hundreds or thousands of miles in hours. Step by step, his breakdown looks like this. First, asymmetric ice growth increases stress at specific latitudes. Second, the lubricating layer beneath the crust transitions, its viscosity drops, and it can shear easily. Third, the crust decouples from deeper layers. It does not stop the core or the mantle. Those keep spinning at nearly the same angular momentum they had before. The crust, however, slips into a new orientation that better balances the mass at the surface. He described potential shifts on the order of right angles, enough to place present-day polar regions at temperate latitudes and shove mid-latitudes into new polar positions. From there, he followed the physics of inertia. The atmosphere has mass and motion. Near the equator, air moves at about 1,000 miles per hour relative to the axis. If the land beneath stops relative to that motion, even briefly, the air does not stop with it. In his scenario, the crust jerks. The sky keeps moving. Wind speeds spike to levels that strip soil, topple forests, and grind infrastructure to rubble. Trees do not bend, they shear. Sand becomes a blasting agent. Anything exposed erodes in minutes. As the shell rotates into a new position, regional wind fields shift in waves. So the event arrives in pulses rather than a single gust, each pulse with enough force to scour. He extended this inertia logic to the oceans. Water masses also retain momentum. As the crust slows and repositions, basins lurch under moving seas. Coastlines become collision zones where water overruns land at high speed. On shallow continental shelves, the surge would stack up, forming walls of water that sweep far inland. The first move would not be uniform. Narrow straits become jets. Broad plains turn into temporary bays. Flow directions reverse as the crust's reorientation progresses, leaving cross-hatched patterns cut into sediments. He pointed to outsized ripple fields and scoured channels as signatures of water, moving faster and deeper than normal river or storm processes could achieve. The crustal slip also loads the lithosphere in awkward ways. Stress accumulates along old weaknesses, and new fractures propagate. In his sequence, magma responds to sudden pressure changes. Some volcanic systems shut off as conduits collapse. Others blow open as gas-charged melt finds relief through fresh cracks. He envisioned curtains of fire along rifts, ash clouds darkening skies, and lava floods adding to the chaos as the shell twists. The sun's position, from a local point of view, would seem to stall or veer as the ground underfoot changes orientation relative to the axis. Navigation by stars fails, not because the stars move, but because the crust does. Mainstream geophysics rejects the mechanics behind this cascade. Modern models describe the mantle as a highly viscous solid, not a free-flowing lubricant at a depth of 60 to 120 miles that could let the whole shell skate in hours. Plate boundaries concentrate motion. Plates creep centimeters per year as heat drives convection. The ice load stresses continents, but the mantle responds slowly, a rebound measured across millennia. Even true polar wander, which does shift the crust and mantle relative to the spin axis, appears to unfold over long timescales, not a day. No seismological profiles show a global decoupling layer with properties suited to a rapid planetary slip. That said, there are uncertainties about internal dynamics that keep the conversation from closing completely. Geomagnetic reversals occur. Field strength waxes and wanes. The patterns of core flow that generate the magnetic field change in ways we still struggle to predict. The coupling between core, mantle and crust involves thermal, chemical and electromagnetic factors that no single model captures in full. Large earthquakes have nudged Earth's rotation and shifted the distribution of mass enough to alter day length by fractions of a millisecond, which confirms that angular momentum exchanges do happen. Those observed effects are tiny compared to Thomas's vision, but they show that the system is not perfectly rigid. In the end, his model stands as a schematic for sudden reconfiguration. Ice asymmetry as a load, an internal lubricant losing stiffness, a crust that slips, atmosphere and oceans continuing on their trajectories, winds and waters becoming the agents of destruction, fractures and eruptions following load paths. The physics he used relies on inertia and momentum, which are real, but he applied them to a planetary interior that modern measurements do not support. The larger question remains about timing and thresholds. If the deep engine of Earth has modes we have not mapped, could there be rare intervals when couplings weaken and behaviour departs from the average? That uncertainty sets up the next step. If the planet's interior is more dynamic than our textbooks suggest, then the earliest signals of change would show up where we can measure them, in field strength, pole position, seismic coupling, and the tiny changes in rotation that hint at stress redistributions unfolding out of sight. So if Thomas's disaster cycle had a telltale prelude, what would it look like on the instruments we trust today? You wouldn't see continents sliding. You'd see needles creeping on compasses, satellites asking for recalibration, pilots repainting runway numbers, and ground-based magnetometers logging quiet drifts that add up to directional confusion. The first clue wouldn't be visual, it would be logistical. Navigation updates arriving more often than expected. Models revised not every 5 years, but sometimes in between because reality moved faster than the schedule allowed. The drift of magnetic north used to look tame. Through much of the 20th century, it advanced at a steady walking pace each year, the kind of shift that cartographers noted and then forgot. By the late 1990s into the 2000s, the pace accelerated from around 9 metres a year to roughly 40 metres yearly. That change sounds small until you try to land a plane, calibrate a drilling rig, or align a radar system. Global models that underpin GPS, aviation, and military systems required emergency updates to keep charts aligned with the sky. The cause isn't settled. Researchers track flows in Earth's liquid outer core, but no single model explains why the drift sped up when it did, or whether it will slow again. A faster moving pole doesn't prove a crust shift, but it does prove that our planet's magnetic engine has moods. As the pole sprints ahead, the margin for error shrinks. Airport runways marked with magnetic headings must be renumbered. Surveyors correct bearings more often. Even smartphones need up-to-date field models to orient maps accurately. When an entire infrastructure stack depends on an invisible field that will not sit still, small errors become system problems. At the same time, the planet's shield shows thin spots. The South Atlantic Anomaly is a low field strength region stretching from South America into southern Africa. Satellites passing through it experience higher radiation doses and increased glitches. Many operators shut down vulnerable instruments on transit to avoid damage. In recent years, this weak zone has developed into two lobes, complicating avoidance and forcing new flight software strategies. The anomaly doesn't mean the field is collapsing, but it does mean the protection isn't uniform and the weak regions are dynamic. Engineers plan around it. That planning is its own kind of warning. Our best machines are already editing their behaviour to survive the sky above the South Atlantic. When we look beyond magnetism, Earth's mass tells another story. Large earthquakes redistribute the planet's interior by centimetres, and that is enough to change how it spins. The 2004 Sumatra Andaman earthquake slightly shortened the length of a day by microseconds. The 2011 Tohoku event in Japan nudged the planet's axis and altered day length again by tiny amounts. These are small numbers, but they prove a point that matters here. Our world responds to internal stress in measurable ways. The ground moves, the spin shifts, and the time on precision clocks registers it. A rigid, unbending Earth is a myth. The real Earth is elastic and coupled. Push in one place, and something else moves. None of this supports land masses skidding thousands of miles overnight. It does tell us that the system is live. The field wanders. The shield thins in patches. The spin changes by fractions, and the instruments we rely on pick it up immediately. This is where the modern story intersects with Thomas's fear in a different register. If an abrupt shift hit today, the first break wouldn't be a mountain cracking. It would be a spreadsheet, a software alarm, a satellite going into safe mode over the wrong ocean. One more deep signal adds unease. In the 2020s, multiple studies suggested that Earth's solid inner core does not rotate in perfect lockstep with the mantle. It may speed up, slow down, pause, or even reverse relative to the layers above on decadal timescales. The geophysics community debates amplitude and period, but the basic takeaway is clear. The heart of the planet has its own rhythm. If the inner engine's timing changes, the field it helps generate can change too. We don't yet know how those shifts map onto surface measurements beyond the slow dance we already track, but the existence of that internal variability removes the last comfort of a machine running on a single predictable gear. Put these threads together and you get a practical forecast, not an apocalypse. Magnetic north is drifting faster than it used to, forcing more frequent updates across navigation-dependent fields. The South Atlantic Anomaly exposes satellites to harsher radiation, and its evolving shape demands new mitigation. Major earthquakes quietly leave fingerprints on Earth's rotation, reminding us that the planet's mechanics flex and respond. The inner core's relative motion hints at deeper cycles we've only begun to resolve. Translate that into daily stakes and it sounds like this. Grid operators watch space weather alerts because a strong solar storm during a period of magnetic instability can induce currents in long transmission lines and stress high voltage transformers. Those transformers are hard to replace quickly. Satellite designers harden electronics and plan safe mode passages through weak field regions to avoid radiation damage. Aviation authorities adjust routes and runway designations tied to magnetic headings. Surveyors and mineral explorers revise models so their maps match the field on the ground. Each adjustment is small. Together, they sketch a world that must constantly correct for an unseen variable. So the early warning signs aren't headlines, they're maintenance logs, version updates, quiet renumbering. If a major shift arrives in our lifetimes, the cascade won't start with rock. It will start with electrons. Satellites glitch. GPS drifts. Timing networks falter. Power grids take unplanned loads. In a society bound together by precise synchronization, a magnetic surprise can spread faster than any storm front, and the first places to go dark are the ones that keep the rest of the map lit. Our entire digital world leans on a magnetic scaffold most people never think about. GPS satellites need an accurate model of Earth's magnetic field to resolve positioning and timing down to microseconds. Power grids use that same invisible weather to stay balanced, because long lines can act like antennas when the field gets disturbed. Undersea cables carry financial transactions and synchronization signals that expect steady timing pulses derived from satellite constellations. Cell towers hand off calls and data using clocks locked to space-based references. Even drilling rigs, pipeline inspection, and precision agriculture depend on geomagnetic stability baked into navigation software. The paradox is simple. The more precise we become, the more vulnerable we are to the kind of instability Thomas warned about, even if the ground never moves an inch. We've seen a preview. In 1859, a solar outburst now known as the Carrington event surged through Earth's magnetic shield and into telegraph wires across 2 continents. Operators reported sparks from key sets, paper catching fire, and lines working with batteries disconnected because geomagnetic currents did the job for them. That was an era of copper lines and handwritten messages. Today's equivalent is a world stitched together by satellites and high-voltage corridors that span time zones. A similar storm would not just interrupt messages, it would push bulk currents into long conductors, confuse navigation signals, and force spacecraft into safe mode. During a period of magnetic weakness, those effects would reach deeper than they did in the 19th century. The heart of the electrical risk sits in transformers. These steel and copper giants step voltages up and down to move power long distances with minimal losses. They are heavy, custom-built, and slow to replace. Geomagnetically induced currents can saturate their cores, overheat windings, warp internal components, and, in worse cases, permanently disable units that feed entire regions. Utilities install monitors and mitigation equipment, but a broad, sustained disturbance can defeat local fixes because the problem arrives everywhere at once. If multiple large transformers fail, the recovery timeline stretches into months. Manufacturing slots are limited. Transporting a single unit demands special railcars, permits and crews. While that clock runs, water plants lose pumping capacity, hospitals run on fuel-dependent generators, and refrigeration chains fail. The cascade moves fast through ordinary life. Food distribution relies on warehouse automation, cold storage, and payment networks. Grocery inventories turn over in days. Without power and data, trucks idle and store shelves gap out. Water treatment needs constant electricity to filter, disinfect, and pressurize municipal systems. When pumps stop, boil notices become moot if homes cannot heat water. Banking systems depend on data centers and network time. When those falter, ATMs go dark and card payments hang. Emergency services switch to local radio and backup protocols, but still face fuel logistics, dispatch confusion, and reduced hospital capacity. None of this requires crashing continents. It only takes a shock to the field that our technology quietly assumes is steady. The damage doesn't end at ground level. Solar storms flood near-Earth space with charged particles that pry into satellite electronics. Designers harden critical systems, but increased radiation doses accelerate bit flips, degrade sensors, and can ruin solar arrays. Operators sometimes shut down subsystems or change orientation to ride out events, which degrade services at the worst time. The South Atlantic Anomaly already forces routine workarounds as spacecraft pass through a weak patch of the field where instruments glitch more often and radiation hits harder. Airlines adjust high-latitude routes during space weather alerts to avoid elevated exposure and radio blackouts. Astronauts in orbit accept higher risk during these periods, and they plan activities around forecasts to limit cumulative dose. GPS itself is sensitive to space weather. Solar storms stir the ionosphere, creating delays and signal scintillation that throw off positioning. Agriculture machines that seed and harvest with inch-level accuracy lose guidance. Surveying equipment drops solutions. Search and rescue beacons take longer to resolve. Timing signals that banks and cell networks use to keep systems aligned go noisy, which can ripple into trading halts and dropped calls. Some ships carry inertial backups, and pilots train on older navigation methods, but those measures assume short outages and good visibility. A multi-day disturbance would expose how little redundancy remains in commercial practice. Grid operators model worst cases and coordinate with space weather agencies. They can shed load, reconfigure networks, and bring peaker plants online to stiffen voltage. Satellite operators update firmware and carry fuel margins to tweak orbits. None of that changes the core constraint. Large transformers cannot be stockpiled at scale, and satellite constellations cannot be replaced overnight. The cost of resilience is high, and market incentives reward efficiency, not surplus. We operate close to the edge because it saves money on normal days. This is where Thomas's old fear intersects with modern reality in an unexpected way. He pictured continents stopping and winds tearing forests flat. We don't need that kind of violence to experience a reset. A geomagnetic storm that arrives during a trough in field strength could cripple the systems we treat as oxygen. The world would still spin, oceans would stay in their basins, yet the practical experience on the ground would feel like stepping backward decades in a week. Cities would quiet except for generators and sirens. Rural communities with local generation might cope better, but fuel and parts run out. Information would fragment into local islands, and rumours would travel faster than facts. The lesson is not fear, but clarity. A civilization built on precise timing and continuous power functions beautifully, until the sky throws off the rhythm it relies on. The blueprint for damage is already public. Long conductors, sensitive electronics, and narrow margins. The question is whether we treat the magnetic environment like weather we prepare for, or like a background constant we notice only when it fails. Because if a field disturbance can knock down timing, navigation, and power all at once, then the kind of reset Thomas warned about doesn't need a moving crust. It only needs a solar storm to arrive on the wrong day. The moment of truth arrived quietly. The CIA's crust archive went online in 2013, and buried among dull procurement forms and travel vouchers sat a folder with Chan Thomas's name on it. People expected a smoking gun. What they found felt stranger. The scan included the Adam and Eve story, but the file around it looked like someone's desk drawer dumped into a copier. Pages didn't line up. Formatting flipped mid-scan. A few leaves were blank on one side, then stamped on the other. Where readers wanted a clean manuscript, they got a collage that raised more questions than it answered. Confusion hardened into a narrative. Online forums decided the CIA had released only a sliver of a much larger book. The number 284 circulated. If the folder showed 57 pages, the rest must have been suppressed. That claim spread fast because it matched the legend, a prophetic text hidden for decades, then quietly redacted. But the early publication record cuts against it. The original 1966 printing was short, a booklet-length release. The strange gaps in pagination match real-world printing quirks. Title sheets, reverse pages left empty, and copy artifacts where a clerk scanned both sides of a document that had text on only one. The file's odd contents didn't help. Tucked between the apocalyptic theory and routine agency cover sheets sat a handwritten shopping list with tools and car parts. Another page was a clipped article from People magazine. There were office memos that had nothing to do with geology. In the margins, penciled notes drifted between administrative shorthand and first-pass identifiers a caseworker might jot while building a profile. None of it matched the image of a hidden vault of world-ending knowledge. It looked like a working folder, collected items that travelled together because a staffer kept them together. That points to a simpler chain of custody. During the Cold War, agencies filed material on people who touched sensitive projects. Thomas worked in aerospace and electrical engineering. He was around defence contractors. He published unusual ideas. In that era, those facts were enough to trigger a routine background review. Caseworkers folded in everything. A book, a TV appearance note, a magazine clipping with a name match, a contact number scribbled on the back of a memo. The folder reads like that. Part diligence, part catch-all. The 57-page confusion becomes less mysterious with that lens. A thin trade printing in 1966 goes to a niche audience. A government employee requests a copy for a file. It gets photocopied, misaligned, and stapled. Decades later, the scan inherits every flaw of the original copy job, including missing backsides and page numbers that skip because the originals had blank filler. The aesthetics of censorship, black bars, heavy redactions, are mostly absent. What appears instead is the aesthetics of bureaucracy. Uneven toner, curled corners, and unrelated inserts shuffled by habit. The messy portfolio had an unintended effect. It made Thomas into a riddle. The clipped article and shopping list felt like clues. The inconsistent formatting looked like signs. Viewers projected intent where there was likely none, because the context fit a satisfying story. A classified book about the end of the world, a spy agency folder with holes. Put together it reads like deliberate concealment. But standard practice often produces that same pattern without any conspiracy at all. Cold War process explains the classification itself. Contractors with clearances drew attention. Unconventional publications by those contractors drew more. Agencies assembled material not to endorse a theory, but to know who was saying what, and whether any of it crossed paths with active programs. Anything describing mass casualties, infrastructure collapse, or global destabilization tended to get filed. A geologic reset narrative touches all three. That is enough to justify cataloguing, even if no one in the room believed the mechanism. This is why the file's most confusing details make sense when you assume a caseworker rather than a censor. Marginal notes, flag names, dates, and simple cross-references. A popular magazine clipping anchors identity in the public record. A shopping list ends up in the folder because it sat on the same desk when the pile was carried to a copier. The result is accidental theatre. It suggests hidden layers, when the real story is clerical friction and the long tail of office habits. Secrecy still changed the book's fate. Once classified, the booklet slipped from view and gained mythic weight. When it resurfaced, the scan's gaps amplified that myth. The legend grew not because the content demanded it, but because the process around the content invited speculation. A thin manuscript locked for decades, then released in a form that seemed incomplete, taught readers to look for what was missing rather than what was present. That is how a modest geophysics speculation became an enduring legend. Even so, the folder tells us something more interesting than a censorship tale. It shows how one person, an engineer with clearance, a public face on strange topics, a hobbyist of the paranormal, triggered a paper trail that mixed catastrophe theory with the trivial. That blend reflects the world Thomas inhabited. Defense labs by day, esoteric claims by night. A book that tried to fuse geological cycles with civilizational resets, then found itself stored between a memo and a magazine clipping. So the file we finally got was not a hidden archive of world-ending secrets. It was a snapshot of an era and a man, framed by the procedures of an agency that kept tabs on anything that could ripple into public panic or cross into sensitive research. If the content disappointed those hunting for redactions, the context complicates the picture in a better way. It raises a different line of inquiry about the author himself, the circles he moved through, and why his name kept brushing against UFOs, angels, and missile guidance in the first place. We move from a messy folder to the man whose life didn't fit into one. Chan Thomas came out of Missouri in 1920 with a straightforward skill set. He was an electrical engineer who built his career inside the most serious rooms of the Cold War. He held roles at McDonnell, Douglas, and Bell Labs, places where precision mattered and speculation had to pass through test benches, wind tunnels, and review boards. That's the first half of the story. The second half is stranger. The the same man walked onto one of the country's biggest late-night stages and talked about UFOs to a mainstream audience, not in whispers. On April 7th, 1965, he sat under the studio lights on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, opposite actress Eva Gaber, and discussed high strangeness with the composure of a professional used to being taken seriously. That contrast raises a problem you can't wave away. How does a defense contractor become the calm, public face of extraterrestrial talk on network television? His resume didn't read like that of a crank caller. It read like a systems engineer trusted to make hardware behave in an unforgiving environment. McDonnell Douglas during those years was building aircraft and working on missile programs. Bell Labs was the place where communications and electronic standards were being invented. These credentials anchor the claim that Thomas could not be dismissed as an amateur. He had access, clearances, and a reputation to protect. Yet he leaned into topics most engineers avoided publicly. Follow his bibliography and the gap gets wider. Alongside the Adam and Eve story, he wrote about ESP. He wrote about UFOs. He even put his name on a book about natural childbirth. That mix looks odd until you see the common thread. An appetite for liminal areas where experience outruns consensus. In electrical research, you learn to respect invisible fields you can't see but can measure. In missile guidance, you accept that tiny disturbances produce large errors unless the system anticipates them. If you think that way, catastrophes are not just slow-moving trends. They are threshold events where a stable system crosses a line and behaves in a new way. Seen from that mindset, a pole shift is not fantasy. It is a hypothetical mode change waiting for a trigger. A researcher who takes ESP seriously might test for weak signals buried in noise. A geologist by temperament insists on bedrock. Thomas straddled both rooms. Now add the Cold War reality. An aerospace engineer who publishes unconventional theories and mails manuscripts to agencies will get noticed. Not because censors are chasing ghosts, but because procedure requires it. Employees in sensitive industries were routinely checked, their outside writings logged, their media appearances noted. Thomas checked every box that would flag a file: defense contractor, public platform, topics that intersected with national narratives about space, technology, and unknown aerial phenomena. If he sent the Adam and Eve story into official channels, the folder that formed around his name didn't need belief to grow. It needed a clerk and a stamp. That makes the surveillance theory less dramatic and more plausible. The CIA's attention could have been attached to Thomas, not because of a single claim about crustal movement, but because of who he was and where he worked. Monitoring didn't imply endorsement. It meant he sat at the overlap between defense work and fringe topics during years when leakage of any kind worried security officers. Speaking about UFOs on television with your employer listed in the press kit, that guaranteed someone clipped the segment and added it to a growing packet. The presence of unrelated items in the declassified file, mundane notes, irregular add-ins, fits the pattern of a personal or office working folder, not a curated scientific archive. The timeline also shows how his centre of gravity drifted. In 1966, the Adam and Eve story reads like a tight technical speculation about a mechanical catastrophe. You can disagree with the physics, but the tone is focused. By 1993, when he released an expanded edition, the book no longer stayed in the lane of geophysics. He added chapters about angels and psychic phenomena. He stepped fully into the world he hinted at on late-night TV. This turn reframes the 1966 work as the least metaphysical thing Thomas ever published. If anything, the original text is the control sample in his catalogue, the one where he tried to build a bridge from mainstream science to a radical model using engineering language and disaster mechanics. So which engine powered his apocalypse? Did the reset cycle come from calculations and archives, or from a worldview that treated anomalous experiences as data? The mix of credits and interests cuts both ways. On the one hand, a Bell Labs and McDonnell Douglas background suggests he knew how to weigh evidence and discard noise. On the other, His curiosity about ESP and angels implies he granted reality to things that most labs would bracket off as subjective. That blend could lead a thinker to see patterns across myth, geology, and electromagnetic anomalies, and then assemble them into a single story about Earth's periodic resets. It could also push him to interpret ambiguous signals as proof of a cycle others would call coincidence. His television moment matters here. Going on The Tonight Show in 1965 was not a subculture move. It was entry into the national living room. That says Thomas was comfortable making his case outside of technical journals. It also means public perception would shape how agencies viewed him. A visible aerospace engineer discussing subjects the government treated seriously for different reasons. In that context, the classification that followed his book could have been a bureaucratic reflex to the messenger as much as the message. The person who emerges is neither a hoaxer nor a prophet. He is a Cold War engineer with a taste for the borderlands, confident enough to carry fringe ideas into mainstream venues, and credentialed enough that those ideas couldn't be dismissed without someone first opening a file. The later spiritual turn shows where his compass pointed when he wasn't constrained by hardware and deadlines. The earlier, restrained manuscript shows what his theory looked like when he tried to keep one foot on the lab floor. Which leads us to the uncomfortable middle ground. If his mind lived between instrument panels and metaphysics, then his pole shift story might be a hybrid, wrong in mechanism, right in intuition, and timed just early enough to collide with discoveries that would make parts of it look less outlandish decades later. So let's separate the man from the model. Geophysicists reject the notion that Earth's entire crust can skid in a day. The mechanics don't hold, and the geological record doesn't show a planet-wide layer cake of synchronized destruction. But when you move past the headline claim, several pieces Thomas treated as supporting evidence have aged better than expected. He pointed at sudden floods, abrupt climate swings, ancient structures that didn't fit neat timelines, and a planet whose magnetic behaviour ties into climate and radiation exposure. On those fronts, the record now holds real episodes that rhyme with his instincts, even if they don't validate his mechanism. Take the floods. Thomas pictured oceans racing across continents. That scale and speed are not supported by stratigraphy, yet the Pacific Northwest bears the scars of the Missoula floods, repeated outbursts from an ice-dammed lake that drained in hours, scouring canyons and leaving house-sized boulders hundreds of miles from their source. The channeled scablands remain a map of what sudden high-energy water can do. Far away, the Black Sea shows signs of a rapid transgression when rising Mediterranean waters poured through the Bosporus and expanded a freshwater lake into a salt sea. And at the close of the last ice age, meltwater pulses surged off retreating ice sheets, rearranging rivers, drowning coastlines, and carving new landscapes. None of these events required a sliding crust. They were still fast enough and violent enough to leave permanent marks and to seed stories of a world reset by water. Climate steps add more weight. The younger Dryas onset hit with speed that is now clear in ice cores, a steep drop in temperatures across the North Atlantic region in a time frame that mattered to living generations. Ecosystems shifted, megafauna ranges collapsed, and human groups had to adjust their subsistence and settlement patterns in ways archaeology can see. Volcanic eruptions provide another lever for abrupt change. Large events can inject aerosols high into the atmosphere and clip global temperatures for months to a few years, disrupting harvests and triggering regional crises. Even if these are not world-ending, they show how fast the system can move compared to assumptions of slow, smooth transitions, and the preservation of animals in frozen deposits, including mammoths with intact soft tissue and stomach contents, points to episodes where cold and burial arrived quickly enough to outpace decay. Archaeology has also shifted. Göbekli Tepe pushed organised monument building deep into the late Pleistocene before agriculture dominated. Its carved pillars and planned enclosures forced a rethink about when complex social coordination appeared. Along coastlines, submerged structures rest on paleo shorelines that were dry when sea level stood lower. The dates overlap the final stages of deglaciation, when rising seas claimed broad shelves. Taken together, these finds have nudged timelines for social complexity earlier, while also reminding us that evidence near coasts, prime real estate for early settlements, was vulnerable to post-Ice Age sea rise. Thomas's suggestion of a last reset around 6,500 years ago doesn't align with a single planetary wipeout, but that period does coincide with known environmental shifts and the growth, movement, or collapse of regional societies. In other words, history in that window wasn't quiet. Now to the magnetic thread. Thomas linked planetary magnetism to climate and upheaval. We can't back a one-day crustal jump with current physics, but magnetic variability is real. The Lachamp event about 42,000 years ago stands out. A brief excursion when the field weakened markedly. A drop of that scale reduces shielding from cosmic radiation and can alter atmospheric chemistry. Modern instrumentation shows the magnetic North Pole drifting faster in recent decades, and the global field strength trending downward over the last 2 centuries. None of this proves a mechanical crust slip. It does confirm that magnetism, atmosphere, radiation, and climate interact in ways that matter for living systems and technology. The paradox is simple. Thomas connected dots across floods, climate lurches, ancient construction, and magnetic shifts to argue for a single catastrophic gear. Modern research keeps finding dots in those same places, but the connecting lines differ. Instead of one-day tectonic failure, we see stacked regional disasters, abrupt yet physically grounded climate swings, and social systems that prove both resilient and brittle. Instead of oceans leaping the continents as a single planet-wide wave, we see drainages that failed fast and seas that climbed relentlessly over centuries. Instead of a magnetic switch that flips the crust, we see a field that pulses, roams, weakens, and at times nearly collapses. This still matters for the bigger question: how a complex civilization fares when the background state changes quickly. Past megafloods show how water can reorganize a landscape faster than a society can adapt. Abrupt cooling episodes show how food systems and migration patterns can pivot within a lifetime. Submerged coasts show how the archive of human beginnings is biased by sea level rise. Magnetic excursions show how the planet's radiation shield can thin, with cascading effects on climate chemistry and, today, on infrastructure. In each case, Thomas's intuition that Earth operates as a coupled system holds up better than his proposed trigger. That puts him in an odd place. He missed on the headline mechanism, but he anticipated several research frontiers: sudden hydrological reorganizations, rapid climate swings recorded in ice, earlier than expected complex construction, and a magnetic field that can sag and wander. He framed them as parts of a single cycle. Science sees overlapping cycles with different clocks: ice sheets, oceans, volcanoes, the sun, and Earth's magnetic dynamo, sometimes aligning to magnify stress on ecosystems and societies. So where does that leave us with his book? Not with a blueprint for an overnight pole flip, but not with a story to dismiss outright either. It sketches a world where rare, fast events do more work than we once credited, where coastlines shift within human memory, and where magnetic instability has consequences beyond compasses. That is close enough to reality to make the legend stick. Which brings us back to the locked file and the bureaucrats who handled it. Was the danger that Thomas was wrong in a spectacular way, or that he was close enough to be useful in a different kind of calculation? We circle back to the puzzle at the centre of this whole story. The CIA didn't stamp a calculus textbook or a classified missile manual. They flagged a slim volume that said, "Civilization gets erased on a schedule, that advanced societies rose and vanished long before recorded history, and that the next reset could arrive sooner than anyone expects." In the Cold War, agencies treated ideas as potential vectors, not just facts. Catastrophe theories, even speculative ones, fell into a bucket that analysts catalogued because they touched on mass casualties, social stability, and morale under stress. A book that collapses confidence can be as disruptive as a bomb if it catches the public at the right moment. Inside that era's machinery, the move wasn't exotic. Aerospace employees lived under routine surveillance, especially those hopping between defence contractors and media appearances. When someone with active or recent clearances mailed around a manuscript about Earth's interior and violent global resets, the system responded the way it was built to. It opened a file, tracked the distribution, and kept a copy. Classification did not signal scientific endorsement. It reflected a workflow designed to reduce surprises, where anything that could spook markets, recruitment, readiness, or alliances earned a folder number and a restricted label. That brings in the bureaucracy that rarely makes headlines. Analysts monitored contractors not for their beliefs, but for their patterns. A person moving between missile guidance labs and esoteric topics increased the chances of accidental disclosures. Even a poetic analogy about the planet's interior can echo a classified model if it mimics language, diagrams, or failure modes found in sensitive research. The safest bureaucratic response is to hold the material tight, note who touched it, and let time decide its importance. Psychological warfare loomed large in that calculus. The 1960s turned doomsday into a market. Paperbacks about apocalyptic timelines sold in airports. TV shows dabbled in ancient mysteries. Public interest in catastrophism tracked upward with civil defence drills, fallout shelter plans, and fresh footage of atmospheric tests. Agencies tasked with measuring social mood kept an eye on trend curves. A narrative that says civilization can end in a single day and government can't stop it rattles the fragile trust needed to sustain deterrence, tax compliance, and mobilization. Even if officials dismiss the mechanics, they learn to monitor the memes. There's another layer that makes the file less strange. Several of the peripheral claims sounded wild then, but now brush against data. We have evidence for abrupt climate shifts that outpace slow textbook curves. Archaeology keeps pushing capability earlier, forcing timelines to flex and inviting questions about how much got lost to rising seas. And we now know that our magnetic shield varies on human timescales, with clear consequences for satellites, high-latitude aviation, and grid stability. None of this proves that continents can skid in a day. It does prove that nature delivers shocks fast enough to matter within a lifetime. That partial validation turns into a problem set for institutions. If the headline mechanism fails, but crucial side effects are real, sudden floods, freak cooling, field weakening, then the theory becomes a hybrid, wrong in structure, right about vulnerability. In a Cold War mindset, that kind of half-right model can be more dangerous than a clean fantasy. It sticks to the brain. It spawns follow-ups. It seeds a subculture that keeps asking if leaders know something and won't say. A cautious agency doesn't want that free-floating anxiety airing unchecked. The deeper recognition here is less about geology and more about mismatched clocks. States plan in election cycles and budget years. Militaries plan in 5 and 10-year increments. Insurance models stretch a few decades. Earth runs the long game. Ice sheets, mantle flows, magnetosphere wobbles. These operate on scales we scarcely teach outside specialised labs, yet pieces of them wobble into our century and touch our tools. Thomas overreached on the mechanism, but his theme, that our systems sit on top of processes we do not schedule, hits a nerve that planners recognise. So classification starts to look like risk management, not the suppression of a smoking gun, but a way to limit amplification. The binder includes a slender book, some clippings, administrative detritus, and a chain of custody. That messiness reads like routine office life because it was. It also reflects a habit. If something might spook the public or tempt an adversary to weaponize a narrative, put it on a shelf where access is traceable. The signal isn't scientific faith, it's institutional caution. The irony is that the modern world has drifted closer to the part of the theory that doesn't need moving continents. We entrained our lives to constellations of satellites, timing signals, and high-voltage lines stretched like nerves across continents. A field fluctuation that would have annoyed telegraphers in 1859 now threatens hospitals, banking, water pumps, and logistics. A minor astronomical tantrum becomes a social stress test. That's the sort of vulnerability analysis a Cold War shop would quietly admire and quietly fear. If Thomas was half right, wrong about the Earth slipping like a loose shell, right that cycles can blindside us, then the file's existence makes a different kind of sense. Intelligence work in that period wasn't just about missiles and codes. It weighed stories, myths, and models for how they might bend behaviour in a crisis. A catastrophe narrative with a whiff of plausibility earns a file, not because it predicts the end, but because it could move people in ways that complicate deterrence and response. Which brings the puzzle home. The classification might have reflected an early recognition that narratives about resets are themselves destabilizing. They invite fatalism when you need discipline, panic when you need patience, and conspiratorial churn when you need clear channels. Whether Thomas mapped the planet right or not, his book pressed on a pressure point, the hidden fragility of a civilization that believes it can schedule everything. And if that's what earned the stamp, then the next question isn't why the file existed, but which cycle our own daily lives suggest we may already be inside. So let's bring this down from ancient timelines to right now. Every era thinks it's unique, but ours stacks a specific kind of instability that's hard to ignore. We run a planetary nervous system built on satellites, timing signals, and long-distance power lines. At the same time, we're logging faster magnetic pole drift and a thinning magnetic shield, while our atmosphere deals with stronger heat gradients, more volatile storms, and higher energy in the system. None of those facts alone is unprecedented. Their convergence with total digital dependency is. That creates a strange vulnerability. Our navigation, finance, agriculture, logistics, emergency response, and air traffic all depend on stable geomagnetic conditions and uninterrupted space-based timing. GPS timing anchors stock trades and cell networks. Surveying, precision agriculture, and shipping lanes need position accuracy most people never see. Those systems assume our planet's magnetic behaviour stays within predictable bounds. But the drift rate has sped up, and the field's strength has declined. Even modest space weather now forces operators to recheck assumptions more often. The paradox is simple. The smarter our systems get, the more delicate they become. You can see the early warning signs in places you wouldn't expect. Airports repaint runway numbers because magnetic headings shift. Airlines update navigation databases more frequently to keep approaches safe. Satellite operators plan safe modes during radiation spikes, shutting down equipment as they crossed weak field zones. Weather prediction leans on satellites that must dodge energetic particles or risk sensor degradation. Power grid control rooms include space weather dashboards alongside load curves and frequency monitors. Grid planners review transformer risk from geomagnetically induced currents and rehearse how to shed load fast if a storm distorts currents across long transmission lines. Analysts at agencies that watch the sun, like NOAA, watch active regions, coronal mass ejections, and solar wind parameters, because a single event lined up the wrong way with Earth's magnetic field can seed widespread disruption within hours. Monitoring helps, but there's always uncertainty. A flare can erupt without warning. A coronal mass ejection can arrive with a magnetic orientation that couples strongly with Earth's field and drives currents through ground systems. In the best case, we get an alert with enough time to reconfigure. In the worst case, the wave arrives faster than procedures anticipate. Satellite anomalies during storms are not hypothetical. High-energy particles inflict single-event upsets on electronics, trip fault protections, and shorten component lifespans. Lose enough spacecraft at once and you lose global coverage of communications, timing, and weather. Weather gaps reduce forecast quality. Navigation errors ripple into shipping and aviation. Timing faults break synchronization across networks. Each failure breeds others. The weak link isn't any single machine, it's how tightly everything connects. On the ground, large transformers are the Achilles heel. They're custom-built, difficult to replace, and sit at key substations. Geomagnetically induced currents can push them into saturation, heat windings, and cause permanent damage. Replacing a fleet of them isn't a matter of days, it's months, sometimes longer. During that time, regions would ration power, prioritise hospitals and water systems, and shut down industrial loads. The economic hit from even a regional outage would be enormous. A continent-scale event would be another category altogether. This is where the idea of cycles re-enters, but not as prophecy. Many ancient cultures treated time as repeating patterns. The Maya tracked long counts. Hindu traditions describe yugas. Egyptian sources speak of earlier ages of order and renewal. Aboriginal traditions hold dreamtime histories that loop rather than run straight. Across these systems, eras end and reset. Whether or not those frameworks align with physical cycles, they reflect a memory. Stability breaks, then returns. Modern risk sits in a different place than the cataclysms those myths describe. We don't need new oceans on the move to see a reset. A moderate geomagnetic storm, far below the most extreme historical event, could grind daily life down quickly in a hyper-connected economy. No plastics without power to polymerize. No refrigeration without power to compress. No fuel distribution without pumps. Water treatment, rail signalling, port cranes, warehouse automation, and medical supply chains all rely on continuous electricity and timing. People 2 centuries ago had local buffers. We've traded buffers for efficiency. This shifts the question from will the crust move to how much shock can our systems absorb? Plenty of engineering answers exist. Harden satellites against radiation, build transformers with better tolerance, segment grids to limit cascading failures, stock critical spares, add offline navigation backup for aircraft and ships, and keep analog procedures alive. Those are practical, not apocalyptic steps. They assume storms will come and that our job is to reduce coupling between failures. If you step back, Thomas's vision looks less like a literal forecast and more like a metaphor for fragility. He expected the ground to give way under our feet. What's actually unsteady is the scaffolding we've wrapped around the planet. We reset not because continents slip, but because systems cross thresholds. We lose function, we forget workflows, and we relearn basics. That's a reset too, just quieter at first and closer to home. The signs we track today are mundane until they're not. A runway designation change, a satellite in safe mode, a transformer running hotter than expected during a storm, a grid operator watching solar wind numbers on a secondary screen. Together they tell a story. The sun is active, the field is restless, and our dependence is rising. If a larger event arrives, the first failures would look like paperwork and delays, rerouted flights, patchy GPS, cell networks desynchronizing. Then it gets more tangible. Rolling blackouts, closed ATMs, water restrictions, pharmacies short on refrigerated drugs. That gap between annoyance and crisis is the window that matters. It's the time to throttle load, isolate faults, and switch to backups. It's also where personal and community preparedness still counts. Radio backups, local water storage, cash on hand, and skills that don't require a charger. Those steps aren't admissions of doom, they're acknowledgements that the world occasionally jolts. So when we ask what cycle we're in, the answer may be less mystical than it sounds. We're in a phase where the space environment and our infrastructure dependence intersect in risky ways. If the next turn of the cycle comes, it may arrive not as continents in motion, but as screens that go dark all at once, and stay that way just long enough to remind us how quickly memory fades when the signal stops. Let's steady the pulse for a moment. Earth's history holds long stretches of calm, continents inching, climates adjusting over millennia, ecosystems adapting. Yet the same record preserves abrupt turns. A volcano darkening skies for years, an ice dam breaking and carving a state-sized channel in days, the the magnetic field weakening and flipping direction over spans that matter to living things. This dual reality is not a riddle, it's the operating system of the planet. Stability does the heavy lifting across deep time, while volatility writes the chapters we still argue about. Life persists through both. It adapts, shifts range, reshapes behaviour. Civilizations, however, prefer the stable chapters, and we build as if they'll last forever. Now to Thomas. His central engine, an entire crust slipping over a molten layer within a day, conflicts with what seismology and mantle physics show. Earth's lithosphere rides moving plates driven by convection and ridge push over millions of years. The mantle is not a free-flowing lubricant. It behaves plastically on long timescales and resists rapid wholesale motion. A one-day reorientation leaves no global layer of synchronized faulting, no universal tsunami deposits, no worldwide volcanic horizon matched to a single year. Those signals aren't there. Yet he pointed at some real phenomena. Abrupt climate swings are documented in ice cores. Sudden floods have remade landscapes. The magnetic field drifts and weakens in ways that affect technology and biology. He guessed wrong about the mechanics and timing, but sensed that Earth sometimes moves in steps rather than slides. The classification question loses steam once you view it through a Cold War office window. Defence-linked engineers drew routine attention. Agencies tracked publications that touched mass casualty scenarios, not to bless the science, but to file it, cross-reference it, and decide if it had any overlap with classified programs or public morale. In that world, a theory about rapid, civilization-ending cycles lands in a folder because anything that could sway public behaviour or be spun by adversaries went in folders. That's bureaucracy, not belief. The presence of odd clippings and everyday notes in the file fits that pattern better than any story about hidden geophysics. Pulling back again, the cycle that repeats most reliably is human, not planetary. Knowledge clusters, then scatters. Libraries burn. Scripts change. Floods and droughts push migrations that rewrite languages. Myths capture the outline of events in a form that survives memory loss. Science later strips the metaphor and keeps the measurable core. We regain what we once knew, then add to it, then misplace parts of it again. This rhythm creates the feeling of reset even without a planetary lurch. It's not neat, and it doesn't follow a fixed clock, but it explains why ruins surprise us, and why dates keep moving backward as new sites come to light. That brings us to vulnerability. We built a civilization that runs through narrow pipes, electric power, satellite timing, precision navigation, automated logistics. These threads make everything faster and cheaper, and they bind almost every daily task to a steady magnetic shield and quiet space weather. You don't need a rotating crust to snap those threads. A strong solar storm at the wrong time, with the field unusually weak over key regions, can stress transformers and silence satellites. Airports rewrite runway headings. Grid operators shed load to protect equipment. Banking, water, hospitals and food. Transport stall without coordination. Thomas warned about resets. Our version doesn't require continents to skid. It only needs a system built on tight tolerances meeting a naturally noisy planet. Uncertainty then isn't doom. It's a working environment. We know the field drifts. We know that severe storms have happened. We know that floods can arrive faster than planned infrastructure can handle. The response isn't to fear every cloud, it's to widen margins, harden transformers, stock spares with long lead times, share timing sources so a satellite glitch doesn't cascade, map floodplains to geologic evidence rather than political lines, teach that myths can store observations and that the scientific method is how we test them. Replace the urge for a single grand mechanism with an appetite for multiple, overlapping risks that we can actually reduce. Thomas's story still has a place. It reminds us that the edges of our models are where mistakes hide, that strong narratives can outrun weak evidence, and that sometimes an outsider notices a real pattern for the wrong reasons. We can hold three truths at once. His slip in a day world is not supported, his sense of abrupt change was not fantasy, and secrecy in a nervous era can elevate a footnote into a legend. That combination says more about how knowledge moves through a society than it does about the deep interior of Earth. So where does that leave us? Living on a planet that tolerates our cities most days and tests them some days, using tools that depend on forces we can measure but not control, writing history while we still argue over prehistory. The practical path runs straight through preparation and curiosity. Strengthen the grid, watch the sky, keep records in formats that survive power loss, fund field work that can update timelines without ceremony, treat flood stories as leads, not proof, and treat new data as an invitation to revise, not a threat to identity. There is no clock on the wall counting down to a crustal slide. There are trends worth tracking, systems worth hardening, and open questions worth patient work. The next chapter won't write itself. It will be traced by instruments, archived by people who care, and kept alive by teachers who say, "We don't know yet, let's find out."